Hi, this is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. Hope you enjoyed this critical thought, a detailed discussion on game design, and be sure to subscribe and you can pitch future critical thought topics. Alright, for today's critical thought, we're going to be talking about the importance of words. Obviously, what I'm saying to you right now, what you're going to probably be commenting with in a few minutes. This is going to be loosely based on a post over on Gamasutra by quote-unquote old man in the industry Jeff Vogue of Spireweb Software. He talked about how video games tend to use too many words, and he cited the RPG Pillars of Eternity, there you go, as an example. When it comes to writing and even talking, it's very tricky in terms of picking up the skill set you need to be able to properly convey something to someone. Now, when it comes to anything like this, be it writing or presenting or even just having a conversation, usually the less words the better. And this is something that I've had to learn the hard way, growing from as a writer to the podcast to what you're seeing now, and of course the presentations. When I first started writing, I was writing like 1,200 to 1,600 word articles, which had a lot of stuff in them, but it kind of felt like they were getting a little bit bloated out. For those of you watching this, when you typically read an article or something, whatever, online, is there a word count that you find yourself just starting to drift off to when an article reaches that or beats it? Now, when it comes to video games and even doing any kind of presentation, it's typically seen as the less words the better. And one of the challenges, especially with any kind of presenting, is knowing exactly how many words to use. Because again, most people aren't going to tell you can only say 5,000 words or have a video game script of 4,000 or anything like that. And it's important to understand what message you're trying to convey to the audience. And I'm going to use some of the things I've picked up with talking over the last few years as a good example. When I do either presentations, podcasts, and stuff like that, there's typically two kinds of modes of discussing. You have the presenting mode, which is what I'm doing to you right now, or when I'm on stage. And this is when I'm talking and I know I'm not getting any input from the audience. Again, if I ask you any questions right now, I'm not going to be getting an answer anytime soon. But the importance of this is I have to keep the conversation going, but I also have to keep it interesting. Because it's very easy, I can just sit here and blab for the next 30 minutes, and yes, I'll keep talking, but will I actually be making any kind of point? Now, the other kind of communicating is when you're trying to have a conversation. This is typically for interviews or when we do our podcasts. In this case, it's more about being able to carry on a conversation and less about just you talking. You have to still be interesting, but it's important to be able to bring the other person in. And if you've listened to podcasts that we've done on Game Wisdom or some of our live casts, you can tell when someone has got it down. And one of the most important things is that you can't mix the two. If I'm talking as a presenter, I don't want to be blabbing for 15-20 minute long examples if there's supposed to be someone else in the audience or I'm trying to carry a conversation. But if I'm presenting something, I'm not supposed to be, leaving room open for people to laugh or expecting people to comment. And that usually leads to very cringe-worthy presentations when someone's trying to interact with the audience at the same time they're trying to get through something important. And like I said with the podcast, you can tell, I know I've certainly been able to tell, when the podcast is not going well. Be it the person is just not responding to any questions, or someone just talks for 20-30 minutes straight. And this is the kind of thing that, like I say to a lot of people when we have them on for podcasts, it just comes with practice. You're not going to wake up one day and be the perfect public speaker. Case in point right there. But it's still an important skill, nevertheless, to understand. And when it comes to video games and what Jeff was talking about, he approached things from the lore angle, which I want to get to in a minute. But there's also from the game design point of view when it comes to using too many words. As we've talked about many times over on these vlogs, being able to properly explain something to a player, especially if it's an esoteric or unique mechanic to your game, is very tricky. You go into too much detail and you may overwhelm someone. Not enough, and they may have no idea what is going on. They may see the action on screen, but they may not know what exactly you just did, and it was all just fluff to them. And for myself, I've always been a visual learner. It's why I've really enjoyed games like the Talos Principle, the Swap, or Portal, rather than games that try to explain things entirely through text. And one of, I guess, the key takeaways for today's vlog is the fact that less is more when it comes to words. If you're typing like a 20,000 word description for your game or 20,000 words of text for all your descriptors and stuff, it may be better to cut things down, especially when you're trying to explain gameplay. When I did my talk about tutorial design, and George Fan, former PopCap employee of Plants vs. Zombies, he talked about in his presentation that you want to use as few words as possible when discussing game mechanics, because you want things to be as short and concise. And I think he said that typically you want to use, I think, no more than 8 or 10 words for any kind of tooltip or descriptor. And that's one of those things, right off the bat, I'm sure some of you are thinking that sounds impossible. But that is a hallmark of someone who is great at writing. Because if you can explain something in 10 words or less, then you're going to make that as easy to understand as possible than someone who has carte blanche. Because again, it's easy to write 10,000 words. It's another matter entirely to write 10,000 words that actually mean something. And it's very similar to the misconception of when it comes to game funding. If you have $500,000 and you think to yourself, well, if I have $5 million, then that makes my game automatically 10 times better. No, it doesn't work like that. And being able to properly manage whether it's money or the amount of words you're using is a very important skill. Now, when it comes to the lore side, and what Jeff was talking about in his article, which I'll link below, he mentioned how the game just front-loaded any and all exposition and lore when it wasn't necessary. And for those of you who are longtime fans, you know how much I enjoy good lore and world building when it comes to a video game. It can add a lot to a title, but there is a time and a place for it. And one of those places is definitely not at the tutorial. When someone is trying to learn your game, you want to be as self-explanatory or as concise as possible. I only need 5 paragraphs explaining the dietary habits of the creatures of this habitat when I'm trying to pick what race I want in an RPG. And RPGs, especially CRPGs in particular, tend to front load their games with these stats and important choices before you're even given an idea of what anything does. Be it games like Pillars of Eternity, Fallout, Skyrim, and I'm sure there are many more examples of this. Now, we do see this in other titles as well, such as the Soul series, which you're supposed to pick a class right from the get-go. But you're not asked to make any permanent or game-defining choices right at the start. Now, in a game like Fallout or Skyrim, however, that's a different story. What you pick as your passives, your race, will inherently affect how your character grows. And in a game like Pillars of Eternity, not only do you have to pick your race, you have to pick your sub-race, you have to pick your class, you may have to hybrid as well, and then you have to pick any skills. And each one of those from Jeff's article had a good paragraph to 2 of extra lore, which at this point has no bearings on what these choices actually mean. Again, actually, here's a great example of something like this. Imagine we have 2 item descriptions. Tell me which one of these items sounds stronger to you. Bow A's description is, this bow fires arrows as faster than the quickest eagle in the land. And then bow 2 is, birds can't comprehend the speed of which these arrows fly past them. Can you tell me which one of those bows is better to you? Now, with that said, there are always exceptions to these rules, and one of the more famous examples would be King of Dragon Pass. This is a fantasy, almost like a choose-your-own-adventure meets light city building game in a sense, where you manage a fantasy settlement and try to guide them to success and not be killed by everyone around you. And what the game did was integrate the lore and the gameplay completely via your council. And you have different members of your council representing culture, military, economics, stuff like that. And when you click on them, you get their thoughts or how they see what your choices are or what you should be doing. And the game doesn't give you a lot of hard data. There's no happiness bar like in Civilization that says, well, if it hits at this threshold, then people hate you. But if it's here, people love you. Instead, you have to basically read into what people are saying and make your choices accordingly. Now again, this would be a case where lore and gameplay are fully integrated. But if you're asking the player to make complicated choices or stuff that will practically define things going forward, it's important to make that as straightforward as possible, and where Pillars of Eternity kind of slipped up on. Now, the other part of this I want to talk about, when it comes to lore, we've seen other games go in the opposite direction and basically hide the lore. And I think you know what the example of this is going to be, and that is Dark Souls. The Souls world is rich in terms of characters, places, events, even just walking around. There's just like the lore of how everything is looking like. But a lot of this lore is hidden in the item descriptions, and this keeps them completely divorced from the gameplay. You can pick up a sword or a new piece of armor or a key, and you don't even have to care at all about what that represents. But if you click on that item description, you're going to be given at least 2 to 3 paragraphs of the history of this item. If it belongs to a character, you'll get a little bit of their personal history. And this way, you have very lore-rich characters such as Sif and Lady Astera, or Lady Maria, I'm sorry, which you can certainly dig into their history, or you can just kill them and move on to the next battle. It's entirely up to the player in terms of going forward. But this will be a case where the developers basically give themselves as many words as they need to talk about these items, but the player who's not interested in it is not punished. I mentioned this on Twitter, but a game like Solero Infernum from a few years ago also worked along this way. Every item has a massive lore description about it and the history, but then there's also like a very short and concise description that says, this item gives +5 rolls, or increases attack by 3, and that's all. So, to wrap things up for today, again, the moral for today is always try to use less words whenever possible. Try to only use the amount that you need, be it when you're writing, talking, or coming up with descriptions or tooltips for your games. Because again, if the player is to understand this, it has to be given to them as short as possible, because there's only so much you can properly process at one time. And for people, when you front load games with exposition and lore, most of it is just going to bounce off of them because they're going to be busy trying to figure out how your game plays. For instance, when I talk about that game from Atlas in an earlier Critical Thought, I mentioned the first 15 minutes, nothing gameplay related happens. And we can also say the same thing about Persona. But Persona tries to present things at least a little bit more lively, and I can skip that if necessary. But if there's one thing you don't want to do is just overwhelm your player or your audience with just a verbal garbage pile coming at them. So, to wrap things up, for those of you watching this, can you think of games that went a little too exposition heavy? And on the flip side, can you think of titles that did a really good job of being as concise as possible with explaining how things work to the player? Let me know in the comments below, but thank you so much for watching today's Critical Thought. We did it in under 20 minutes, so That's a bonus for when we're talking about not using extra words. If you're new and you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe. And let me know if you have any ideas for future critical thoughts or industry insights. But be sure to check back daily here and on GameWisdom.com, where we examine the art and science of games. And I will catch you all next time. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And come back around 10 Eastern for regular streaming. For a collection of my writings as well as weekly podcasts on game development, be sure to check out game-wisdom.com. Follow me on Twitter at GWBycer for updates throughout the day. And to help support everything that I do, you can find me on Patreon under GWBycer or Game Wisdom. Your donations can help to keep things running, and when we hit some goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy. So, thanks again for watching, and be sure to come back for daily discussions on game design on the Game Wisdom channel.